or when somebody sees it. Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Azure podcast. This is being recorded on October 6th, 2021, and this is episode 397, and we're going to be talking about the new preview feature, Capacity Reservation with Bill DeForeest. Kendall, Kale, what do you guys have for news today?
Yeah, so I have, it's just like it's not a major update, but it is, I think, a good one. So in GA now, you can basically enable the hierarchical namespaces for existing storage accounts. So I think we've had some people on before to talk about Azure Data Lake Storage and Gen 2, which is basically built on the power of blob storage already, enhances that experience, provides some additional capability and functionality. And so I believe before you could not convert an existing storage account to the kind of Azure Data Lake 2 enabled storage account, and now you can do that. So that's just something to keep in mind, and we'll put in the show notes the article around why you might want to do this, what the change might actually look like from an impact perspective, and then how you could actually enable that if and when you wanted to make use of it.
Yeah, great. Kale?
Yeah, I had a few. I'll go through these quickly here. Give me 1 second. The first one was around VMware. So there's a good article out here from Eric Lockhart about the VMware solution updates. Essentially, we've announced some new regions. I think Brazil South and East 2 are now. So I think there's 17 regions now in Azure that support the Azure VM stack. And then basically there was some stuff around FedRAMP in there as well, around the Azure VMware solutions, and then some technical articles around some of the new experiences that are in preview that are coming for that, such as the ways to run commands inside vCenter and some policy stuff and disk pools and whatnot. So take a look at that. It's just a further growth of those who are using VMware in Azure. Second one was around NetApp files. I'm not as closely connected with this, so Evan or Kendall, if you guys are closer to this, around this wait list, did either one of you have any feedback on it?
Yeah. I mean, this is basically, and I'll have to confess, I did not know this, even though some of my teammates work really closely on this service. You would basically ask for NetApp, Azure NetApp files, and then we would have to go do a bunch of stuff for you. It really wasn't sort of on demand like the rest of the Azure pay-as-you-go type services, right? It wasn't provisioning real time. Now what we've done is turn everything on, the services, in a state where, yeah, if you want capacity, it's there. If you want the service, you can just go use it instead of having, basically ask us, and then we go tell you when we're ready for you to leverage it.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think this ties into, sort of the growth and the changes in NetApp files, right? Because talking about the VMware, right, you can store your you can do Azure NetApp files as the storage for VMware now as well, just sort of expanding on the built-in, VMware drive array, and so it's all just tying that in together.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I saw it was like GA in 2019, but then apparently it was a little bit of a heavy lift to onboard. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Cool. And the last one I have real quick is around, and this is not promotional, but it's something we talk about from time to time, is around Gartner, the Magic Quadrants. So Microsoft's been named a leader in 2021 for data integration tools. So that's kind of interesting from like where we're positioning, some of our data tools, like as far as like Data Lake and some of the analysis services and analytics and things like that we're doing. Certainly the low and no code things along with Power BI as part of that as well. So just a shout out about that. And I think there's some links in there around Azure Synapse Analytics as part of the future for cloud analytics.
Great. Yeah, it's always nice to see that the vision that we sort of have is landing well with the world. Otherwise we have to adjust it, but it's good to see when it does land. Great.
Sorry, I was going to add there too, just on the topic of the low code, no code thing. So there's like a lot of conversations happening around Fusion apps, and there's a good PDF kind of like ebook that kind of covers this strategy and stuff. So I'm going to just call that out now.
What's a Fusion app, Kendall? I don't know that term.
I think Fusion app is kind of enhancing the like no code, low code experience, but get in with like API management and other Azure services to kind of enhance the overall end-to-end story there. It's something.
And
that's,
then
yeah,
think about whatever your low code or no code platform doesn't allow you to do, you can extend into Azure. And using APIM as the connector, like you can use all your APIs like you used to, but you get like the front end of a Power App, and that makes like your front end development so much easier and so much faster.
Gotcha. Okay. No, that's great. That makes sense.
Oh yeah, one other thing I forgot there that's kind of important is Windows 11 launched yesterday.
You know, yeah.
So for those who are into Windows, I mean, there's a few of us around. Some new bits there to play with.
I've been running it for months actually. I've been pretty happy, haven't had any issues. So great. Yeah. No. So like I said, we've got Bill DeForeest on to talk about capacity reservation. Bill, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself and share what you do for Microsoft.
Yeah, hey everyone, Bill DeForeest. I work in the core Azure compute team as a program manager. I guess I lug around the title of principal PM manager, which is a way of saying that I work with a group of folks to improve and manage the customer's capacity experience for compute. So we build all the features, and then we have a bunch of awesome supporting teams and frontline teams that do all the actual support tickets and escalations and all that stuff. And we take all that feedback and keep trying to iterate and improve the experience.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you for coming on. I think start the conversation, because I know we want to talk about capacity reservation, but I want to sort of put this out there up front. It is the cloud. Scale is a thing, but at the end of the day, it has to map back to physical resources, and there is a physicality of that. Like, how do we think about capacity in general?
So Azure is constantly expanding our data centers based on all kinds of metrics that we collect that shows demand for usage, known incoming large deployments that our large customers have made us aware of, all of those kinds of things. So we're constantly adding capacity as fast as we can in all kinds of different locations. That said, if you could imagine, say for U.S. listeners, like let's say we were going to announce the Super Bowl like the Monday before, like the site for it the Monday of the Super Bowl, there'd be a sudden rush of people trying to get hotel reservations and plane tickets and all kinds of stuff. Or for those international viewers, maybe the World Cup final. They didn't announce the venue until the last second, and then everybody was trying to show up. Because we are an open service, we are subject to rushes of capacity usage that we don't control. It's an open service, it's an API. If you have sufficient amount of quota and credit with Microsoft, we're happy to let you deploy. And you're right, it is a physical data center. So the creation of this feature does not mean that everyone needs to go reserve all their capacity in advance and make sure that everything's so. In general, our metrics show that the vast majority of time, customers successfully deploy whatever it is that they want to deploy. But there can be situations where we get one of those sudden rushes or unexpected usage surges, and for some, maybe it might be a couple hours, sometimes it's a couple days, we might be running short. And so for those workloads that are super critical to you, maybe it runs your entire business. This gives you an additional layer of protection that says now you can be assured that regardless of you take your VM down for maintenance or anything else, doesn't matter, the capacity is going to be there for you when you need it.
So we have this concept of quota, and then we've got reserved instances, and then we've got on the continuum capacity reservation. Can you explain the delta between those three?
Absolutely, it's a great question. So quota is really, think of it more as your credit limit. It basically is saying Microsoft believes that if you deploy this amount of stuff in our cloud, that you're good to pay for it. We will, in the interest of customer experience, if you ask for quota and we know that we don't have the capacity at that immediate moment for you to deploy, we will sort of call you and say, hey, wait a second, we really want you to have this, but we don't want you to give you the quota and then just have you go fail deployment, right? That's a terrible experience. So there are situations where we do regulate quota in the interest of helping customers be successful, where we might suggest, hey, is this a workload you can run maybe in the region next door? And those kind of things. So But quota in and of itself isn't a guarantee of capacity. I can tell you, without going into too many specifics, that we have far more quota granted in the system than we have capacity in the entire fleet, and that's just the accumulation of it over time, over many, many years. And so but it is an important component of our system. When we're in a crunch mode, we will sort of help customers to be successful. Reserved instances, there are two ways that you can, and the reserved instances are the 1 and 3 year commitments that you can purchase from our commerce team. And that gives you the discounts associated with that. There are two ways that you can configure them. One is we refer to as size flexibility, and that's kind of the industry standard term. So if you buy a DB3 series 2-core reserved instance, if you're size flexible, you can apply that to any VM that you deploy in that B3 series. And so you can imagine that because of that, we don't actually assume that you're going to deploy a 2-core. You might deploy a 4-core and get 50% off, that sort of thing, right? So there isn't a way for us to actively, so we plan for you to consume that many cores, but we don't necessarily plan for exact sizes to be deployed because we don't necessarily know. You're telling us you want to be flexible, and that makes sense to us. And it's a super useful benefit for a lot of customers. If you choose capacity priority, that means that your term discounts only apply to that exact size. And so Azure will now say, okay, we expect you to at some point to show up and deploy this size of virtual machine, and we will plan for that so that it goes into our demand forecast. We build out capacity in order to accommodate that. The thing that we don't do is prevent other customers from deploying, just because you have an RI. So that's not something that Azure has implemented to date. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Maybe you're probably beyond the scope of this particular discussion, but we can come back to it if it's useful. And so now what we're basically saying is we know that what customers really need in certain situations is an SLA, and they want the assurance that if I reserve my capacity, I want Microsoft to actively protect it for me. And that's where this new feature comes in. We could have built it as an extension to the term discount RIs. That was one option that we looked at. The issue is that there are a number of customers with very specific scenarios. I need to deploy with this exact topology, like I need to deploy in a proximity group, or I need to deploy in a particular zone, or there's a number of different scenarios, or they need to combine a set of things in the same location, like M series and E series. And so rather than those would be impossible to express if you go to our commerce team and just say, I want to buy a stack of tickets so that I can cash them in later. And thus we went with this deployable model that says, over time, we're going to add capabilities so you can construct, here's the set of, here's the reservation set that I need for this particular application, and you'll be able to manage that as a group. And so you get the full power of the compute source provider behind that.
Is the capability of capacity reservation meant for like a long running application, or does it also apply to like burst scenarios like what you're talking about for Super Bowl? For instance, I only know the season is going to go for 2 weeks or a month.
Yeah. But the name of the feature is on-demand capacity reservation. The on-demand part means that it's a deployable object as opposed to something you go buy from our commerce team. And capacity reservation is the part that says we're actively going to protect it for you. And it is, since it is a deployable object, you go against the compute RP and you say, I want to reserve a certain quantity of a certain size, that there is no term commitment associated with it. You can create one and turn around and delete it right away. Perfectly fine with us. And so that gives you the flexibility to say, hey, I really only need this for my Black Friday surge for like 3 weeks, where I know I'm going to get a whole bunch of extra. I need to be assured that I have an extra amount of capacity. That's great. Come and reserve the capacity for 3 weeks. And then when you don't need it anymore, you can delete it or decrease the quantity of your reservation, depending on how you want to do it. So yeah, short term is absolutely supported. And it's another reason why we chose this deployable object approach, was to support those kinds of scenarios.
So going along, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Kendall. Sorry,
okay.
There was a delay there.
Yeah, no worries. So going along with, kind of Cynthia's question to some extent, or maybe just some of what you've shared. So I'm hearing like VM SKUs, right? I've heard some of those tossed around, but how does this work when it comes to like platform as a service, or, like, is this available for like multi-tenant services, or is it only available if you want to set aside compute for like a like this is my reserved instance of this virtual machine? Like how does it apply, I guess, when you go from like IaaS to PaaS, or even serverless?
Right.
Like is it applicable?
Right. So right now in the preview, it is available for infrastructure as a service deployments. So when you create a virtual machine, you have a property that you can set that says, I want to consume a capacity reservation. And the reservation would have already been deployed and exist. We will add support for other services, like we expect to add support for AKS. We've been in conversations with them. We've just started conversing with some other Azure services. And essentially what those services will need to do is surface the ability to associate their deployment to a capacity reservation. And once they do that, then all of this will then be able to work. We're looking at a few different options for some of the more higher level PaaS services, but again, it's early stages. You can expect over time, we don't have a delivery time frame, but you can expect us to continue to expand the set of ways that you can consume this. The main limitation to be aware of right now in that architecture is that because it's a deployable object, everything in Azure is deployed in a subscription. And so that reservation exists for that subscription. The number one feature ask that we've had from customers, aside from finishing V1, which actually is, of course, always the top priority, the next most important feature ask is the ability to share reservations across subscriptions. And we know that that's a key ask from customers, and it's something we're actively designing. Again, I don't have a delivery time frame, but we are absolutely aware of that requirement, and we are actively working on trying to build that.
One question I had, Bill, on the reservations, and so let's say I'm a large e-commerce site or something, and I'm starting to do some planning for a seasonal type burst that I'm thinking about, as you guys were talking about there before. Is there any like guidance you could give, or like some feedback or advice to people who are in that position? Like, hey, make sure you do that like at least 2 months before you're ready to do it, like things like that. I realize like most of the capacity is there, but is there like a good rule of thumb? Like, hey, don't come 24 hours before that and start like requesting massive, compute,
Yeah, that's another great question. It varies from region to region. Depending on what customers are doing. So it's very difficult for me to sit here and say there is a rule of thumb where you're going to feel like, absolutely confident of success. I would say that there's two things you can do. Certainly not waiting until 24 hours before is a good idea. Like at a certain point, you need to you look at what is your timeline to deploy, reason backwards from that to say, what happens if I try to create the reservation and it fails? You need to give yourself enough time to work with Microsoft to figure out how we're going to help you be successful. That's what our support teams are for. It's one of the strong points of Microsoft is our support teams are there to help everybody try to be successful. We expend tremendous amounts of effort, and obviously you folks are great representatives of that effort. So that's really one way to that's the first way to think about it. And then and then the second thing is to when the more restrictive you are in saying, I got to have exactly this configuration, I got to have exactly in this zone, I got to have this right, and that's sort of all that much more time you want to give yourself ahead of time before it's becomes business critical. And that's the second piece I would say is it somewhat depends on the business criticality of this. If this is something that you're reserving, but what if I got 80% of it, it's okay. It's not that super critical to me. So we'll see some customers want to do the reservation just so they can sleep easier at night, and that's perfectly fine. That's another piece to evaluate. But there isn't really any global rule of thumb that I can give, because as soon as I give it, there'll be the counterexample that someone will bring up, and totally legitimate, right? This is public cloud, right? It's to use another analogy, it's like a restaurant. I can tell you what the situation is now, but on Saturday night, it may have been super busy. The next Saturday, it's not so busy because it turns out there's a big game and everybody's there instead of the restaurant, right? It varies a lot.
Makes sense. Thanks.
I like your restaurant analogy because, we've all been in that situation where I have an anniversary, some big event, whatever it is, you make a reservation and you show up and they're swamped because there's a ball game that night, in the local area.
Mm-hmm.
And so you sort of get preference for it, but you're not actually guaranteed that you may not have to sit around waiting for the seat. but it sounds like what you're talking about with, and that's sort of what I'm not even sure exactly. It doesn't map exactly, but it sounds like capacity reservation is basically saying, hey, I'm gonna slip the the host or hostess $20 ahead of time to make sure that my seat's sort of still sitting there, right? I mean, again, it's not exactly a map, but is that the right way to sort of think about the analogy of these, as we're trying to enable those different ways to plan and levels of safety?
Yeah. So the way I try to explain it is more, this is where I sort of go back to my hotel analogy. So the reservation for compute is equivalent to you checking into a hotel. There's no statement that says you're actually in a room at any given time. The room may be actually empty. You could be gone for 3 or 4 days, but as long as you're checked into the room and you're paying for that room, it belongs to you. You can come and go as you please, that sort of thing, right? And so that's distinct from what we think of as a hotel reservation, which is I'm going to say at some point in the future, I want to reserve a hotel for 2 weeks from now. That is not a concept that yet any cloud, that to my knowledge, none of the major clouds have implemented. We are actively thinking about that scenario. We've heard that request from customers. It's a very messy technical problem. It's even a messier business problem, because if I'm going to commit to you that I'm going to sell you this capacity in 2 weeks, that means that I can't sell it to anybody else unless I have a deadline that says they're going to be checked out or they're going to be gone out of that capacity space in that 2 week period.
Give it back.
Because, yeah, right. And so it is something that we're thinking about. It's a relevant scenario. It's going to require a lot more thinking and a lot more development on our side. And so I'm not even prepared to say we'll ever do it, but it is something we're aware of and something we're thinking about, for sure.
Yeah, great.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that analogy, that's way better than my restaurant one. That makes a lot of sense.
It was my fault. I led you down the restaurant path, and then I right turned you back to the hotel. So yeah.
I tried to go out to dinner. I ended up in my hotel room.
Yeah.
So,
welcome to PM World. Yes.
So Bill, I'm kind of curious. Like, let's say I'm a customer, and it's nice. I totally get the SLA and like wanting certain things for governance or like compliance or to get better sleep, whatever. What are ways that I can actually evaluate as a customer if this is the right approach for me, right? Or is there data that surfaced up that kind of lets me know, hey, in this region, this is the typical capacity, or this is, is there any analytics I can do on my side to actually justify to the business why I think that we need, this particular, option for us?
Yeah. So let me start by backing up one step, making sure that we're all on the same page as far as the cost structure. So when you create a reservation and it is unoccupied by a virtual machine, so it's sitting there empty, waiting for you to deploy your virtual machine. In that situation, you are incurring additional costs over what you would have incurred, because now you have basically told Microsoft, I'm committing to consuming this. I've checked into my hotel room and I'm paying for it. But if your reservation is occupied by a virtual machine, then there's no additional cost, because the cost of the reservation and the cost of the virtual machine is one and the same. So we don't charge you twice. You're either paying for the empty reservation or you're paying for the VM. You're not, and so having a VM that is occupying reserved capacity is just extra protection for you. It doesn't cost you anything extra in that situation. So that's the first sort of thing to think about is if this is a business critical application and I'm going to be doing maintenance on my virtual machine, I'm going to take it offline for a couple hours during my planned maintenance period, and then I'm going to redeploy it. At that point, you're really only paying for like a couple extra hours of VM time. On top of that, if you bought a term discount, this is a long-term thing. You may well have bought a 1 or 3 year term discount. It isn't costing you anything extra because the reserved instance term discount is already paying for that capacity. And so there's lots of situations where it just makes sense from a protection. The only cost really is the extra overhead of creating the reservation and making sure that you're managing your virtual machines to consume the reservation. And there isn't any real monetary cost, either because it's mostly occupied by a VM or because it's covered by a term discount that you've purchased, the 1 or 3 year reserved instances. And the 1 or 3 year reserved instances apply automatically to empty reservations as well as virtual machines. It's actually literally under the covers. It's the same SKU. If you reserve a D2 V3 reservation and you have a D2 V3 reserved instance, then it applies to the reservation. If the VM is deployed to it, then it applies to the VM. It's all the same. So it all just kind of works out that way. So the scenarios where, oh, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say, this reminds me, if we're talking metaphors of like, I'm going to pay $100 or $1,000 on this bar tab tonight. And if we don't hit the bar tab, we still pay $1,000. But if we do, we were going to pay it anyway. Yeah. Okay.
Right,
Got it.
Yeah. So, right. So then there's the scenarios where you're not occupying the reservation all the time. And that's really the scenarios I think that you're asking about. So there's two typical scenarios that we hear from customers. The biggest one, frankly, is disaster recovery. So the Europeans half joke about what happens when Amsterdam is underwater. Right, that when we talk to them, this is always the example they use. Obviously we hope that never happens. That would be a terrible thing for all the people there. But in the event that it did, it's going to probably affect our data centers because it's water and computers don't go that well together. And so at that point, you need to, the customers that are there, if it's business critical applications, they need to have a contingency plan, just like they would have in their on-prem world where they had one data center that was their production and they probably needed to have another site somewhere else in case the main one went offline. In that sense, right, the cloud isn't that different. You still have the issue of how do you make sure that you have a recovery plan in case something really disastrous happens. And so that's a common question we get from customers is, how do I make sure that I have my VM capacity in a different location? And so this is this is the feature that will let you do that, where you can say, I'm going to reserve capacity in a different location, and it's justified from a business perspective because maybe my entire business comes to a halt if I don't have this application up. Well, that's a pretty good justification for having that capacity. And what we recommend is that when you're not in disaster, either testing or actual, hopefully never, but if you're not in actual disaster recovery, that is because it's a reserved, you can deploy any other virtual machines you want. So we see customers using putting their non-production testing environments or other kinds of things into that capacity. So you're not paying for the non-production stuff separately. You've already paid for it with your capacity reservation. So it's a little bit different mindset about how to consume the cloud. And the reservation lets you safely swap VMs in and out, and that capacity remains committed to you regardless. You don't have that fear of losing your capacity anymore. We do have customers today that have fully deployed and just turned off their disaster recovery environment. They just power off the VMs, but they're still allocated because that's how they guarantee themselves capacity. And the value of this feature now is I can deallocate those VMs if I want to, and I can use it for other purposes. I can get more value out of that capacity. And then the other one goes back to the question you asked earlier, which is I need to scale up or I have a near-term deployment that I need to do. And that goes back to the business calculus of how critical is this? If you're not sure, you can talk to our capacity operations folks and how do they can give you some idea of what's the current state right now. They can recommend that you deploy, maybe a couple weeks ahead of time. But again, it goes back to that business value to you. If you're making sufficient money for your business off of or it's sufficient operational value to you, deploying a week ahead of time probably isn't that huge of a cost. And so that's where we that's how we kind of think about it.
Bill, I'm curious from behind the scenes, since for capacity reservation, we already know that the customers want capacity X. Does spot instances come in play in any sense? Or is that like completely different spot instance at its own service?
Yeah, another great question. So you should think of spot as separate. So when you create a capacity reservation, you're paying the applicable on-demand rate or having that covered by reserved instances, the term discount reserved instances. Spot, the real benefit to customers is the discounts that they get, because that's the main difference between doing spot versus on demand. And so deploying spot into a reservation kind of doesn't make sense, because then you're paying sort of full price for your spot because that you're using capacity that you're already paying full price for. So they are really kind of parallel offerings. Spot is very much a as available we will give you the capacity at a discount. But customers should be prepared for, sometimes as we get that unexpected surge, right? The ball game lets out, all of a sudden everybody's at the restaurant. And that means a lot of extras. There's no extra seats available. And so using Spot effectively requires customers to really be flexible in location, in VM size, right? The customers that we see with the most success are very flexible. And of course, reservations are kind of the opposite of that. You're saying, I'm going to deploy this exact size in this exact location up to at least this quantity, right? So yeah, they're very much parallel systems, and they both have their places for customers.
Cynthia, I was thinking something similar though. Like it almost like if you're in a restaurant and the reservation says like noon, and someone comes at 11:50 and is like, "Can we sit here until they get in?" And
yeah, because that's kind of what I was asking. Because
yeah.
we knew that there's a set capacity they want to reserve, and from like behind the scenes, we have the spot instance available for the next hour or for the next couple hours. Like from Azure perspective, do we then kind of slot that in for this time and then like slot something else in for another time?
But I feel like that would be dual selling, right? Like we'd actually be selling something a customer's already paying for to another customer for a subset of time. Double charging.
Yeah.
So don't tell anybody.
Yeah. So the SLA applies to when you show up and at allocation time, we will issue. This is not, the SLA is not yet available. Just to be clear, we're still in preview, right? So that's not going to become something that's applicable until we GA the feature. And yes, I'm teeing. I know that question's coming, and we'll answer it when you get there. But when the SLA becomes effective, it is an allocation time guarantee that says when you go to allocate an on-demand virtual machine, we will guarantee that you get capacity. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get everything else related to the VM, or that there could be other kinds of errors. There's a documentation link that I can share with you folks. There are some limitations of different things that we do and do not support with reservations, so customers should be fully aware of that before investing in this. But yes, if you're not using your reservation, that Azure will see that as freely available capacity, and we may use it for our internal purposes, absolutely. But that doesn't have any effect on your SLA as a customer. You're still guaranteed. If we had to evict whatever else we had in order to create room for you, then that's what we'll do. And we always carry buffers anyway, so the Spot doesn't generally literally consume every single available core, because that might delay we might have to wait to evict Spot in order to deploy on demand, and we don't want that to be the customer experience. So we're always carrying some extra buffer to make sure that the deployment goes smoothly and is performant and all that sort of stuff. And so you should never see a situation where you reserved something and then you have to wait an extra 30 seconds while we evict Spot. That's sort of not how the system's designed. But yes, that essentially the SLA is at allocation, you're going to get your capacity, and you won't be negatively impacted by any way that Microsoft is using the capacity, just like we would for any other situation.
Yeah, no, this is great. In some ways, Bill, this makes my head hurt. I don't want to think about sitting on your seat on a daily basis. Although this is great. Like I told you when we invited you on, I have this conversation with customers all the time, and I was super interested to hear how you were gonna talk about this. So I'm gonna steal this for a call I have, I think, tomorrow. Awesome. I'd also like to point out, by the way, that Bill had hotel room, I had restaurant, Kendall had bar. Tabs. So I think Kendall's is probably the most fun.
I had a recent experience going to a karaoke place with my friends, and they were like, you have to hit a minimum to do karaoke, and we're like ordering food we didn't even because at some point you're paying it anyway. So.
Oh, so there's food in the bar tab, not just drinks. Oh, okay, I got it.
Yeah. Come on.
Okay, no,
I have seldom been accused of being the most. I have been seldom been accused of being the person the most fun on a podcast, so I wasn't expecting that. It's all right.
No, that's great. Any last thoughts you want to leave the listeners with, Bill?
The only other thing I will say is this is a nuance of the feature that I just want to point out, is that you should always think of a reservation as a minimum. So if you reserve 10 virtual machines, we're saying there will be at GA, there will be an SLA for you to deploy 10 VMs of that size in that location. Nothing says that you can't deploy more than that. And Azure, you can go read the documentation. We refer to it as over allocation. it is kind of the most nuanced part of the feature, and I just want to call out, people should go read that and understand it. You don't have to worry about if you hit an auto scale rule, whether you're Microsoft's in the middle of the night, that you're going to hit the cap of your reservation and we're going to say, nope, sorry, you can't deploy. But nor should you think of this as a cost management tool. That's not what this is. It's very much we're going to give you a minimum guarantee of capacity for your on-demand res VMs. And if you want to go blow right past that and spend more on Azure, because that helps your business, please do so, and don't let, and you're not going to, reservations are not going to get in the way. So that's the, so I just want to make sure to call that out, because that is a slightly nuanced topic that people should go read about.
Yeah, we'll get some pointers for some links from you and put those out there, because yeah, I think this is one of those topics that it's going to take some people thinking about a little bit to decide what's the right way to leverage it for their business, and everybody's going to be a little bit different, right, in that matrix.
Agreed.
So this is great. Kendall, absolutely. Cynthia, any last comments? Okay, great. Bill, thank you very much for coming on. You know, I think this will definitely be, we may have to get you to come back later on as this feature continues to evolve to talk about where it's gone. So great, thank you.
I'd love to be back. I appreciate you having me on.
Thanks, Bill. This was great.
Okay.